Well, we're here with Dr. John Morrow, the author of The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad, or The Covenants of Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the World. And that subsumes a number of compacts between Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him, and the world's Christians. This is a topic that is very relevant today as we see interfaith strife and sectarianism and violence spiraling out of control in so many places around the world. And in particular, in the West, we hear that Islam is a violent, fanatical religion, or at least has these violent, fanatical tendencies that are supposedly inherently part of the faith. And yet, those who've actually studied the early days of Islam see that the reality is precisely the opposite. And nowhere do we see this more than in the study of these covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world and related documents such as the Constitution of Medina. This is such an important topic. It's scholarly, but it's got a lot of relevance for current events. Well, John, it's good to be with you. Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about how you got interested in the covenants.
Well, the story of the covenants traces back to when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Toronto. I was taking a course on philosophy of religion, and I was asked to write an essay. So I spoke with the professor, and I proposed that I could write an essay on jihad in Islam. And the professor said, yeah, sure, no problem. And so I conducted the research, and I wrote the paper. It was over 30 pages long, a little bit longer than he wanted, I suspect. But nonetheless, I was very proud of it. I thought I did a good job, a thorough job. And in that essay, I had quoted this Ashtiname, this covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the monks of Mount Sinai. So that's the first time I was introduced to this document. I submitted it to the professor. And then he returned it, and I think I had a 36% or something like that. It was an F. And so it was quite a blow. But I was a humble young man, and I respected my teachers and my elders, and I said, well, maybe that's what this paper deserves. And so I finished my BA, my MA, my PhD, and so on. And, I teach at many universities in the United States. And about 2009, I decided to compile an anthology of articles and essays that I had written before. That would be published as a book called Islamic Insights, Writings and Reviews. So I'm going through a box of old essays, and I come across my paper on jihad in Islam. And, I look through it and I say, wow, this does have some value. So maybe I will propose to publish it. And so it goes through the review process and everything, and they say, you know what, we're going to publish this paper. Now, this was the first essay I wrote as an undergraduate. And it was at that point that I realized that, I think that professor was a little bit prejudiced against Muslims. So that was my first real taste of Islamophobia. But the thing is, that was this covenant of the Prophet with the monks of Mount Sinai was you could describe it as my earliest exposure to Islam. Of course, I had been Muslim for many years before, but that was the foundation of my understanding of Islam, this document. And so when I decided to update this paper, expand upon it, and make it even more detailed, I was no longer satisfied with an English translation. I wanted the primary document in Arabic. And so I set off on a quest to find the original Arabic. So I started doing research, and I come across a document that was purported to be the Sinai Covenants. And then I read it and I compare it, and obviously it wasn't. It was a covenant that was published in 1630 in Paris, France, by a Maronite monk or priest by the name of Gabriel Sionita. And he published this in Paris, and it was a big hit, and it went through numerous editions, and it was a bestseller for centuries. This covenant apparently had been found in the Middle East in a monastery at Mount Carmel by a French Capuchin monk by the name of Pacifique de Provins, also known as Father Scaliger. He came across an ancient copy of a letter of the prophet. He brought it back. He presented it to the king. The king gave it to Gabriel Sionita, who published it in Arabic and with a Latin translation. So I said, this is not my document. And so I continue searching, and I come across another covenant, which was a covenant made with the Christians of Persia, which was found in the archives of the Cathedral of Julfa in Isfahan in Iran at the beginning of the 20th century by an Orientalist, a scholar, Leon Arpi, who was doing research. He came across this document. He published it. It went unnoticed. Right? I don't know, the book didn't have very good distribution. It didn't, echo in the scholarly community. So, I'm looking for the Sinai covenant. I have an English copy. And then I find this other covenant published in Paris. And then I find one that was published, that was found in Iran. And so I continue my quest to locate that covenant. Eventually, I find a picture of it in a book on Byzantium and Islam, and I contact the publisher and I said, "Is there any way I can get a high-resolution copy of this document?" And she tells me, "Well, sure. Why don't you contact Father Justin?" And so I figured, Father Justin, probably, some Catholic priest, in Boston or something, some Irish guy who's got a copy of it, maybe he visited the monastery. And so they give me the email, and I contact Father Justin, and I say, "Father Justin, would it be possible to get a high-resolution copy of this document?" And he says, "Oh, absolutely. Just let me go downstairs." Go downstairs. So at that moment, I realized that I was corresponding with Father Justin of Sinai, one of the Holy Fathers from Mount Sinai, who's in charge of their archives. He went downstairs in the lobby of the monastery, and he took a high-resolution copy of this covenant, and he emailed it to me. And so I finally had a copy of that document. And I asked him, "Father Justin, are there any other copies of this covenant or different covenants that, the Greek Orthodox Church has or any other churches?" And he says, "Yes, they have a copy at Mount Athos, on the Holy Mountain, in the monastery of Simonopetra." And he said, "Well, good luck getting in there." Right? He says, we're Greek Orthodox, and they don't even grant us access to their archives, right? They don't even answer our emails. So I said, wow, this is going to be difficult. And so by this time, I was invited to give a lecture at Yorktown University. The book had just been published on the covenants, and I mentioned that compared to Harvard University, compared to the monastery of Simonopetra, Harvard University was like an open admissions community college. By the time I get home from this speaking tour, I have a message in my inbox from a monk by the name of Cosmas, who tells me, "I hear you're looking for something." And I said, and he says, "We have not only one, but two copies of the covenant of the prophet." And he sent them to me by email. So I obtained more covenants. And then, of course, I tried to discover the original, what happened to the original copy that Father Scaliger had brought from the Middle East. I figured that, okay, it was in the hands of Gabriel Sionita. What did he do with it? Perhaps it was in the king's library, because the king of France used to collect all kinds of ancient manuscripts from the Middle East. And I said, okay, the Royal Library, I said the French Revolution probably went up in flames. But some of his collection was saved and is in the National Library of France. And so I conduct research in their archives and everything, trying to locate this document. And so I find this manuscript, and I look on the index, the table of contents, and they're just like different Christian documents, debates and discussions and theological things. There was no indication that this document was there. And so I flip, and what do I find at the very end of this compilation of documents? a copy of the covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world. So I was able to locate a copy of the covenant that was brought back from the Middle East by Father Pacifique de Provins. People had questioned the authenticity of this document. They said, oh, he just forged it, he invented it. But this was proof that he indeed had brought back an ancient copy that was several hundred years old, and it is located in the National Library in France. And so I kept looking for more covenants, and when I was in Europe on a speaking tour after the book was released, promoting tolerance and coexistence and so on, I came across a reverend, a Syrian reverend by the name of Nasir, Reverend Nazim Nasir or something. I don't remember his name exactly. But he mentioned and I gave a lecture about the covenants, and he says, you know what? I saw a copy of a covenant at St. George of Humeira Monastery in Syria. And he gave me a copy. I'd taken a picture of it. But the resolution was poor. I couldn't zoom in and read it. So I contacted the abbot there, who was Father Damascenos. And I said, can you get me a copy of this document? And he said, absolutely. And he sent it to me. And since then, I've been in contact with him and, with other patriarchates and so on. And I've uncovered other covenants that he made with the Coptic Christians, with the Jews of the Yemen, with the Zoroastrians. So there are many such documents out there. But it was quite a task in order to locate them and to share them with the world as a whole.
It sounds like a really amazing, almost Indiana Jones kind of adventure to go after these.
Yes, absolutely.
And at this time, we're witnessing a kind of a global propaganda war on Islam from one side,
yes,
and then a kind of a Takfiri terrorist surge from the other side that's led many Christians to flee the Middle East.
The Muslims at that time were very, very small in number. They numbered in the hundreds. And yet this community as a whole accepted Muhammad as their leader because he offered them a better way of life. They were sick and tired of these wars between tribes and kin and clan, some of which lasted for generations and generations. And he proposed them a better model, that they would all be citizens of this ummah, and that identity would be based on membership in this ummah and not based on whether you were black or white, whether you were an Arab or a Jew, whether you were a Christian or a polytheist. Anyone who wanted to unite together as one would do so in this community. And so he prepared this document called the Constitution of Medina, known as the Ummah document, which was made with the polytheistic tribes, the Jewish tribes, and the Muslim community there. And it's very interesting when you look at the early language. The Prophet uses the term mu'mineen, or believers, to describe Jewish people, to describe Christian people. And as for Muslims, he calls them mu'mineen al-muslimin, the believers who have submitted to the Prophet Muhammad and the final revelation. And so he never treated them as kuffar, or as infidels, or as mushrikeen, the Christians. He considered them as part of his community. And in these early documents, he says that they are a part of my community and they're an honor to me. So this idea that the Islamic State is for Muslims and Muslims alone has no basis in historical fact. It is not supported by the traditional interpretation of the Quran, the traditional interpretation of the Ahadith, of the seer of the Prophet, and the study of these covenants. So, some people would say, well, the Jews violated that covenant and, we're at war with Jews. We've been at war with Jews ever since. But this is not true, because the Prophet made a treaty with the Jews of Maqna or Aila, which is located in northern Arabia. This was done during the final years of his life. Mm-hmm. And so that proves, on the contrary, that peace with Jewish people is possible. Mm-hmm. Okay? This is not to say peace with Jewish enemies are possible. And he made treaties with Christian communities in the Sinai, in Egypt, with the Greek Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, the Assyrians, the Armenians, Armenians, the Abyssinians, and he also made treaties with Zoroastrian communities. So from the get-go, from the onset, from the very beginning, it was a pluralistic, diverse community. What happened? What happened? Well, everything boils down to interpretation, okay? I mean, there is a form of Islam out there that professes to be Islam that is unjust, and there's an Islam that's just. There's an Islam of mercy, and there's an Islam of hatred. There's a peaceful Islam, and there's a violent Islam. So there are different interpretations of Islam. But what went wrong? What happened? Well, Muslims strayed from the traditional interpretation of the Quran, the traditional interpretation of the Sunnah, and they forgot these covenants of protection, these charters of rights and freedom that the Prophet had granted the minorities in the Muslim world, that were respected by and large by the rightly guided caliphs, by the Umayyads, by the Abbasids, by the Ayyubids, by the Mamluks, by the Fatimids, by the Safavids, by the Ottomans. There were some exceptions, just like we have good presidents, bad presidents, and so on. Same thing in the Muslim world. In some cases, there were excesses. In some cases, there were leaders that broke the law. But overall, if you look at Islamic history as a whole, the rights of Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, were protected. They were called Ahl al-Dhimma, the people, Dhimma from protection, a dhimmi, a protected person. And some say, well, okay, maybe you protected Christians and Jews, but what about Hindus? Well, we see that when Islam spreads into India, and you have leaders like, Akbar the Great, they broaden the category of Ahl al-Kitab to include people who followed other religions, and even if they didn't consider them Ahl al-Kitab, they considered them Ahl al-Dhimma, protected people. They're all citizens, regardless of whether they're Buddhists or whether they're Hindus, that we have no right to persecute these people and to convert them by force. Unfortunately, however, as a result of colonialism and imperialism, Islam as a political power vanished in the world. You find the Ottomans renewed their covenants of protection with the Christians and the Jews and other communities on almost a yearly basis. And so we have copies of these documents certified and notarized by the sultans. We have copies of them at the monastery of St. Catherine, and also in Turkey itself, in the museum of Topkapi. In Topkapi Museum, they have all kinds, hundreds and hundreds of these documents showing that they were renewed time and again, time and again. So why is it now that I go to conferences and I go to mosques and I present these documents, which are overwhelmingly well received by Muslims? It resonates with them. They can relate with it.
Well, we know this is part of authentic Islam.
Oh, absolutely. And they say, yes, we cannot dispute this. This is undeniable. Why is it that they have forgotten about these covenants? Well, as I explained, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, well, knowledge of these documents also disappeared along with it. And after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was a vacuum that was created in the Muslim world. The imperialists came in, they destroyed the educational system. I mean, you can look at what happened in places like North Africa, where you would be hard-pressed under Islamic rule to find even a small girl who was illiterate. There was a high rate of literacy. They expected everyone to be able to read. At the bare minimum, everyone should be able to read the Quran. And where did they acquire this literacy? In the mosques. Mosques functioned as schools, all right? In the Darija of Morocco, that teacher is faqih. A faqih is a jurist. It was the faqih, the jurist, who was teaching the children how to read, giving them literacy and so on. But the French came in, they destroyed the mosques, they closed down the madrasas, and then within a generation, you go from a population that was overwhelmingly overwhelmingly literate to almost completely illiterate.
It was actually worse in Algeria than Morocco.
Absolutely, because they did social experiments on the people. They allowed the ulama in Morocco to continue to operate to a certain degree, and they wanted to see what effect that would have on the population. And in Algeria, they completely tried to destroy Islam, destroying the mosques and killing the imams and so on. And you'll find that Moroccans are generally more traditional and moderate in their Islam, and they haven't had the same problems with these Takfiri Wahhabi extremists as in Algeria. It was in Algeria where young people who wanted to reconnect with their religious tradition were duped and deceived and led down the path of Takfiri Wahhabism. All of this, it's as a result, as a consequence of the loss of these documents in the collective consciousness of Muslims. So, alhamdulillah, praise be to God that these documents are now being revived and resurrected and disseminated. Yes.
Well, it seems that we're living at a time when freedom of religion is starting to erode. This is a pillar of the Enlightenment. Here in the U.S., many of us at least, are sort of descendants, whether direct actual material descendants or spiritual descendants of people who are fleeing religious oppression from European countries that had a state church. And for instance, in England, the various kinds of Puritans and other kinds of dissenting sects and Catholics at various times were persecuted.
Absolutely.
And this was one of the major reasons for people coming to the New World. And interestingly, at the same time that was happening, people were also fleeing European countries in the other direction, to the Ottoman lands, where they were given a kind of religious pluralism as well. So it seems that in a sense, the U.S., with its First Amendment to its Constitution and this tradition of protecting religious diversity and religious liberty, and indeed encouraging religion, the Founding Fathers were not secularists in the French sense of being against religion.
Absolutely.
They were the opposite. They were in favor of not supporting any particular state church, but supporting all religions. And likewise, it's the same attitude in the Ottoman lands. And so we had people fleeing to the Muslim lands of the Ottomans and to the United States, where a third of the slaves brought here were Muslims.
Yes.
There's a lot in common here between this American approach to religion in general and to religious tolerance and diversity in particular, and the Islamic version. And yet today, we're seeing this clash of fundamentalisms where the U.S. has been hijacked and is the leading force in a sort of a war on Islam, and the other side is showing certain signs of a kind of intolerance and absolutism as well. It seems that maybe we need to, on both sides, get back to our real heritage of being pro-religion, but pro-everybody's religion.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is the remarkable thing about these documents. I have colleagues who are law professors at Harvard and so on, and they've looked at these documents. And all of these rights that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was granting, not just to Muslims, but to everyone. And they say this is unparalleled. In the rest of the world, especially in the Western world, we didn't see any of this until the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, until the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Bill of Rights, and so on. It was completely unprecedented. And you see, at this crucial junction in world history, where we're presented with it's either secularism, atheism, agnosticism, and so on, and liberalism, or religious fundamentalism that is completely and totally intolerant. We have a model that grants people all of the rights and freedoms and protections of a secular Western democracy, but not in which it is man who rules, but one in which it is God who rules, right? So it is God himself who is giving all of these rights to human beings. So it's like you're saying, it is, yes.
And then the question arises, how do we know the will of God? And in the Islamic tradition, it seems that many scholars have ended whatever kind of opinion paper that they're putting out, whether it's a legal judgment or another kind of scholarly piece of writing, by saying, "But God knows best." Wallahu alim.
Yes.
And this seems to me to be very important to any kind of idea of religious governance, because if you have a religious power that absolutely is convinced that it knows the true will of God in every little particular, that religious power is going to oppress people who don't have that same interpretation. So if you're going to have a religious power, it has to be one that says, well, this is our best interpretation, but we're going to leave open the possibility that we could be wrong. And I notice you do that to a certain extent in the covenants book. You know, as you argue for your interpretation of the authenticity of these covenants, you do consider the other points of view, and you're not making an absolute judgment saying, oh, you guys are absolutely wrong.
Yes. I mean, this is a very good point that you make.
Yeah, and it seems that the fundamentalists, the secular fundamentalist side, has some of the same issue with believing that it's got the last word. The secular scientistic worldview that says the world is a material creation, space, time, matter, and we've figured it all out.
And we're dealing with two sides of the same stone, two sides of the same coin. You don't have ISIS without people like Trump. You don't have Trump without people like ISIS. They're both very extreme. If you look at the rhetoric of like these anti-Islamites, anti-Muslimites, these Islamophobes, if you see their interpretation of Islam, it's the very same interpretation of Islam of these terrorists. So they all agree, you know, they make perfect partners in that sense. But I mean, you had asked about how is it that we have come to this, to, you know, these people who are declaring other people as being unbelievers. If you look at Islamic tradition, we have different schools of the law, different schools of jurisprudence. So it was never a question, there is just one way to do something, this is the only way, and the other ways are wrong. They would say no, based on our interpretation and based on weighing these different hadith and based on our methodology, we believe that we should do it this way. And others said, but they always acknowledge that there were other ways. So you'll find, you know, in terms of wudu and in terms of the prayer and other fiqh matters, there are minor differences between the 5 major schools of thought. But yet they all coexisted together. They never said that I'm a believer because, you know, I pray with my hands on the side and you're an unbeliever because you pray with your hands like this. There were different schools of spirituality, different tariqas in Sufism. We had different schools of theology, schools of philosophy. The caliphs used to gather scholars from, you know, they would bring in atheists and free thinkers, and they would bring in, you know, Sunnis and Shi'is and Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians, and they would present a topic, and they would discuss the topic, go back and forth, so that they would all understand better. It was never a question of like imposing one limited interpretation upon everyone. But then, I mean, there was always a conservative branch. The Hanbalis were very conservative. They didn't accept, you know, reasoning, aql, an analogy, and they were very literalist in their interpretation. And then, you know, it became even more radicalized with Ibn Taymiyyah. And then Ibn Taymiyyah influenced Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who took it to, you know, another extreme. And so you have this group, these Salafis, who claim to be following the pious predecessors, who believe in interpreting everything literally, who reject the entire scholarly tradition of Islam, and who believe that they are the only saved sect, and that all other Muslims have returned to Jahiliyyah or are now infidels and apostates whose blood is halal, whose women are halal, and whose property is halal. Now, this was once a very small movement limited to the Najd in Arabia, but after the Saudis come on the scene, it becomes their national religion, and besides oil, they dedicated themselves, using billions of dollars, to exporting this interpretation of Islam to the rest of the world. The rest of the world that was suffering from a vacuum as a result of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, where there was a great deal of illiteracy and ignorance, and this was presented to them as true Islam. And so this is, the root of the problems that we see today.
Okay, well, we only have a minute left. How do you think that we should be reaching out not only to Muslim groups like you're doing here at this conference, but to Christians as well? I mean, the Christians need to hear about this. How can we organize an outreach effort to talk to Christians?
No, absolutely. I mean, we need to speak to Muslims. It's not just a question of interfaith, but we need to do intrafaith, with Sunnis and Shi'is and Sufis. We have to reach out to Christian communities and Jewish communities. But how can we do so? I mean, one sister asked me, well, why don't you just give the Quran to people? Okay, I'm not against it. I think we should. I think, we could and we should give the Quran. But how many people are actually going to read the Quran when most Muslims haven't read the thing from cover to cover? It's voluminous. It's a bit difficult for some people to digest and to understand. And quite often when you hand them a Quran, they think that you're trying to convert them. But if you present to them these covenants, that's very different, right? And you go to a Christian or a Jewish person and say, listen, this is a treaty that Muhammad made with Christians or with Jewish people. Okay? So from the beginning, you're not trying to convert anyone. And we as Muslims are willing to renew our pledge to the Prophet, and we are willing to do, whatever we can to respect these treaties and these covenants. And so immediately, this treaty, this agreement, this covenant serves like a bridge that can help, bond these two communities, something that they can agree upon.
Well, this sounds like a project that not only has a fantastic story behind it, but it has a very interesting future ahead of it as well. Thank you so much, Dr. John Morrow, for your work with the Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world.
Thank you so much.